You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
CRM was supposed to improve customer relationships. Instead, it's shorthand for Customer Rage Machine. Your CRM can't explain why a customer's package took 5 detours? Reboot your inner peace and scream into a pillow. It's okay. On the ServiceNow AI platform, CRM stands for something better. AI agents don't just track issues, they resolve them, transforming the entire customer experience. So breathe in and breathe out. Bad CRM was then. This is ServiceNow.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 510th episode of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, by the end of the last episode, both the Federals and the Confederates were positioning their forces for the start of the campaign. But on the rebel side, on May 5th and 6th, Joe Johnston decided to change his deployment.
Knowing that the Bishop General Leonidas Polk's troops were on their way to Blue Mountain, and having received reports that the Yankees in North Alabama were moving northeast up the Tennessee River toward Chattanooga rather than southeast toward Rome, Johnston decided to shift even more of his strength to the northern end of his line.
Johnston therefore ordered the 2 rebel cavalry brigades at Resaca to join the rest of Wheeler's horsemen in Crow Valley above Dalton. He also directed Canty to move his Confederate infantry from Rome to replace the cavalry at Resaca, and Martin was ordered to assume command at Rome.
On May 7th, Johnston told Polk that he should move all his troops to Rome as rapidly as possible, and he ordered Martin's cavalry from Rome to Calhoun to watch the Oostenaula River between those 2 towns. Johnston also instructed Canty to bring his infantry from Resaca up to Dalton.
However, later on the 7th, Johnston canceled his last order and directed Canty to remain at Resaca, holding his troops ready to come to Dalton by rail while he watched the roads leading from Lafayette to the Resaca area. Now, all of what we said in the last few minutes may just sound like gobbledygook to you, as we throw out a bunch of place names and officers' names, but the upshot is that Joe Johnston was moving those units and Polk's reinforcements around North Georgia, like pieces on a chessboard, to counter what Sherman was doing, or what Joe Johnston thought Sherman was doing here at the start of the campaign.
Here in the first week of May, Johnston was shuffling about some of his units and changing the deployment of his forces based on the intelligence that was coming in to his headquarters at Dalton regarding the disposition of the federal forces. And using that information, Joe Johnston was making a guess as to Sherman's intentions.
By May 7th, Johnston had received a trickle of reports on Yankee activity off to the northwest of Dalton. Lee and Gordon's Mill stood on Chickamauga Creek, west of Taylor's Ridge, some 18 miles west-northwest of Dalton, and about a dozen miles north of Lafayette. As early as May 5th, Johnston knew that federal troops, reportedly Hooker's 20th Corps, were there.
Soon, more reports came in saying that Hooker had moved east, as if to challenge the Confederates positioned on Rocky Face Ridge. Other reports said that McPherson's men from the Army of the Tennessee had passed through Lee and Gordon's Mill on their way down to Lafayette.
However, Joe Johnston was still focused most of his attention on Crow Valley and on the northern part of Rocky Face Ridge. When he did give a thought to McPherson, he assumed that McPherson would continue south through Lafayette since Johnston still believed McPherson's objective was Rome.
Sunday, May 8th, brought fierce Federal attacks on the northern end of Rocky Face Ridge and at Dug Gap. Along the ridge, Yankees from Howard's 4th Corps scrambled up the steep slopes, and once they were at the top, they fought their way southward along its narrow crest until they reached the main Confederate line, which at that point ran across the ridge top and eastward down into Crow Valley.
Howard's Federals, however, could go no farther. The narrow crest of the ridge, which Sherman described as a quote-unquote knife edge, was no place to fight a battle. One Union officer reported, "We are butt up against the enemy and may not be able to advance for some time."
Meanwhile, a division of Hooker's 20th Corps stormed up out of the valley west of Rocky Face Ridge and made a heavy assault on Dug Gap, which was defended by 2 Arkansas Mounted Rifle regiments and 1 of Kentucky Cavalry.
4 regiments of Federals, the 33rd New Jersey, 73rd Pennsylvania, and 134th and 154th New York, made it to the top of the pass, but they were soon driven back by a rebel counterattack. Then, fighting desperately, the Confederates managed to hold their position until reinforcements arrived and secured their hold on Dug Gap.
The Federals lost about 400 men in those assaults, inflicted few casualties on the Confederates, and gained no ground of any importance. Nevertheless, the attacks served Sherman's purpose since they kept Johnston's attention fixed on the northern part of his line, around Dalton.
Late that evening, the evening of May 8th, the leading units of McPherson's Army of the Tennessee, the 9th Illinois Mounted Infantry, and the 39th Iowa reached Snake Creek Gap and found it unoccupied, unguarded, and unobserved by the enemy. Well, that meant McPherson had completed one of the great strategic marches of the Civil War. His presence at Snake Creek Gap was completely unknown to the Confederates, and he was perfectly positioned to strike eastward and hit the Western and Atlantic Railroad near Resaca, thus cutting Johnston's supply line back to Atlanta.
Hindsight being 20/20, we can see that, in all likelihood, McPherson's seizure of Snake Creek Gap determined the outcome of the campaign. Joe Johnston had supposed that McPherson was headed toward Rome, and he was wrong as wrong could be. So now, after May 8th, with the threat McPherson posed to the Western and Atlantic, Johnston could no longer remain at Dalton and in his Rocky Face Ridge and Crow Valley positions, unless he detached troops to retake Snake Creek Gap.
McPherson's march, which took 15th Corps and 16th Corps from North Alabama through Chattanooga to Lee and Gordon's Mill, then by way of Lafayette and Villanau to Snake Creek Gap, hadn't gone undetected by the Confederates. Over the previous few days, Joe Johnston got enough reports from rebel scouts to know the general position and route of the Army of the Tennessee, but Johnston persisted in believing that McPherson's objective was Rome.
Joe Johnston had been waffling about what to do with Canty's brigade, which, as y'all will recall, had arrived as reinforcements from Alabama. Johnston had ordered Canty to remain at Resaca, but to be prepared to move his troops up to Dalton by rail. Then, on the morning of May 8th, Johnston told Canty to begin the movement to Dalton.
However, at 10 minutes after noon, probably in response to a report from Canty that Federal troops were at Villanau, Johnston countermanded the order to begin the movement to Dalton and again directed Canty to, quote-unquote, hold his brigade ready at Resaca.
That evening, Johnston ordered the cavalry brigade of Colonel J. Warren Grisby, one regiment of which had spent the day fighting at Dug Gap, to move south to Snake Creek Gap.
A local civilian guide unintentionally led Grigsby's cavalry astray, and so they didn't reach Snake Creek Gap until dawn on the morning of May 9th. As the leading rebel horsemen approached the southern mouth of the pass, they unexpectedly ran headlong into a small band of Yankee cavalry.
The rebels charged and chased the Federals back into the gap, where Union infantry, unhappy that their breakfast had been interrupted, nevertheless left their campfires and repulsed the Confederate horsemen.
And that was how the Confederates made the unwelcome discovery that Snake Creek Gap was in Yankee hands. Later on the morning of the 9th, a cheerful, confident McPherson pushed his column out from the mouth of the gap to cut the railroad near Resaca, some 8 or 9 miles to the east. Dodge with 16th Corps took the lead, while Logan's 15th Corps followed. But poor roads, rough terrain, and stout resistance from Grigsby's rebel cavalry slowed the Federal advance.
Not until that afternoon did the head of Dodge's column reach a crossroads about 2 miles west of Resaca. There, in obedience to orders, Dodge left one division of his corps to guard against any Confederate force coming down from the north. With his other division, Dodge pushed on to the east toward Resaca.
Now, as you guys will recall, it was originally intended that McPherson's force taking part in the campaign was supposed to consist of the entire Army of the Tennessee, all 9 divisions. But then his strength was whittled down as the force available to him for the start of the campaign was reduced to 7 divisions, then 5. And now here was Dodge detaching one of his 16th Corps divisions as his advance closed in on Resaca.
And so even when units of 15th Corps came up and relieved Dodge's reserve division so it could rejoin the advance, McPherson's column wasn't as strong as it should have been had his force been at full strength as intended.
And the strength of his column, or lack of it, all of a sudden mattered a great deal to McPherson as he accompanied Dodge's lead units and saw to his front that there were rebel earthworks guarding Resaca. McPherson also noted to his left there were those roads running north off toward Dalton. McPherson was suddenly keenly aware that he was operating off by himself and not within easy supporting distance of the rest of Sherman's force, that is, George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland and John Schofield's Army of the Ohio. He wasn't sure how many rebels were manning these fortifications guarding Resaca, nor did McPherson know if hordes of Confederates might appear on those roads on his left flank, sent down from Dalton by Joe Johnston. What James McPherson did know was that Sherman expected him to cut the railroad, but now he decided the risk was too great and that discretion was the better part of valor. So he halted Dodge's advance and pulled back to the entrance of Snake Creek Gap and set the troops there to entrenching.
A small party of Union cavalrymen had managed to reach the Western and Atlantic a short distance north of Resaca, but hadn't been able to do more than cut the telegraph wires and burn a stock of wood intended for the Confederate locomotives using the railroad.
And so Sherman's plan to cut the railroad below Dalton had come very close to success, but had failed. Then and later, typically and ungraciously, he sought to blame the failure on others. On several occasions, Sherman wrote that McPherson had been, quote-unquote, timid, and hadn't acted with the aggressiveness the occasion called for. However, an argument can be made that the responsibility for the failure was Sherman's alone. He'd chosen to send a relatively weak force to Snake Creek Gap. He hadn't provided McPherson with adequate cavalry. As a result, the column often had to halt while infantry performed scouting duties that should have been handled by mounted units. 2 of Sherman's 4 cavalry divisions hadn't yet come up from the rear, but there was no good reason why at least some of the mounted units on Hooker's right in the valley north of Villanau couldn't have joined McPherson once he cleared Taylor's Ridge, thereby providing him with the horsemen he needed.
Sherman's failure to strengthen McPherson's column is even more puzzling because as early as May 6th, the Federals knew that Polk's Confederates were moving from Alabama to Georgia.
Despite McPherson's failure to cut the railroad at Resaca, from a larger perspective, his seizure of Snake Creek Gap still represented a great success for Sherman, because with a large Federal force firmly ensconced in the Gap, that meant Joe Johnston couldn't remain at Dalton, but would have to withdraw from Rocky Face Ridge and Crow Valley.
For the Confederates, it could have been much worse since Joe Johnston had guessed completely wrong about Sherman's intentions. Only the weakness of McPherson's column and his unwillingness to push ahead and cut the railroad had saved the rebels from a shattering defeat at the very beginning of the campaign.
Rain-X wipers are the #1 wiper blades in America. That means all kinds of drivers choose Rain-X. Big drivers in small cars choose Rain-X. Small drivers in big cars choose Rain-X. Drivers with long hair and short commutes choose Rain-X. Drivers with short hair and long commutes choose Rain-X. Drivers with pets on board, babies on board, and bored babies on board choose Rain-X. Basically, drivers who love a clear view of the road all choose Rain-X wipers, the #1 wiper blades in America.
Incoming transmission.
Hello, this is Matt and McKinley from History Dispatches.
We are the father-son duo bringing you the weird, the wild, the wacky, and the craziest tales from across time.
From the Ice Bowl
to the Great Heathen Army.
And the head of Oliver Cromwell.
The same head they kept on a pike for 3 years?
Yep, all here on History Dispatches.
New episodes every weekday.
Find out more at historydispatches.com or wherever you get your podcast app.
With regard to Sherman's intentions, Joe Johnston had guessed wrong in two major respects. He'd concentrated far too many troops in the Dalton area, and he'd remained fixated much too long on the possible threat to Rome.
He'd left Snake Creek Gap completely open, and his defenses at Resaca were suited for protecting the bridges there from a cavalry raid, not for holding off a major attack by a large enemy force.
The place to have defended Resaca against such a force as Sherman sent against it from the northwest was Snake Creek Gap, and so Johnston's failure to guard that passage was an unforgivable blunder. When Johnston transferred Canty and his troops from Rome to Resaca, he didn't inform Canty of the existence of the gap or alert him to its importance. At the same time, Johnston shifted the rebel cavalry that had been at Resaca to Dalton. Since Canty was unfamiliar with the Resaca area, those horsemen would have been a great help to him. If deployed in the valley west of the southern end of Rocky Face Ridge, or at Villanau and along Taylor's Ridge, the Confederate cavalry would have rendered far more valuable service to Johnston than they could ever have done at Dalton.
Canty seems not to have reached Resaca until sometime on May 5th, and on the 7th he received orders to move his troops to Dalton as soon as the brigade of Daniel Reynolds, then on its way from Mobile, arrived at Resaca. Johnston, though, soon countermanded that order and told Canty to remain at Resaca. But by the evening of the 8th, he'd once again reversed himself and told Canty to be ready to rush up to Dalton by rail.
So it's little wonder then that Canty paid slight, if any, attention to Snake Creek Gap. Almost all of the orders Johnston sent to Resaca indicated the Confederate commander's attention was fixed on what the Federals were doing to the north around Dalton. But clearly Joe Johnston didn't grasp the importance of Snake Creek Gap or understand that the purpose of Sherman's posturing to the north was to distract the Confederate commander from the threat posed by McPherson's column.
Sherman was disappointed, or, according to a member of his staff, quote, much vexed, when he learned that McPherson had failed to cut the railroad, but he wasted little time mourning over the lost opportunity.
Realizing that McPherson's seizure of Snake Creek Gap had still gained him a great advantage, Sherman decided to move most of the rest of his force down to join McPherson. Leading the way south on May 10th was one of Hooker's infantry divisions and the cavalry division that had been on the right of the Army of the Cumberland. All day on the 11th, soldiers, wagons, and guns crowded the roads west of Rocky Face Ridge. Heavy rains slowed the movement somewhat, but by nightfall on the 12th, almost all of Sherman's troops were in or near Snake Creek Gap, except 4th Corps and some Union cavalry that remained in front of Dalton.
While Sherman moved most of the rest of his force southward to join McPherson at Snake Creek Gap, Joe Johnston continued his efforts to determine the Yankee commander's intentions.
On May 9th, Johnston received a scout's report saying that, quote, Logan and Dodge under McPherson are on an expedition to Resaca, end quote. However, other reports indicated it was Hooker's Federals who were threatening Resaca.
The prevailing opinion at Johnston's headquarters seemed to be that the stumbling Yankee thrust out from Snake Creek Gap toward Resaca on May 9th was simply a failed raid, rather than a major effort intended to cut the Western and Atlantic below Dalton.
Johnston himself spent the latter part of the day on May 9th with John B. Hood in Crow Valley. He didn't return to his headquarters at Dalton until 9 o'clock that night. And when he did, Hood accompanied him. After studying the reports that had come in that day, Johnston instructed Hood to take 3 infantry divisions, 2 of them detached from Hardee, and go down to Resaca.
Hood departed at once, but early the next morning he sent word from Resaca that the Yankees had withdrawn back into Snake Creek Gap, and he advised Johnston to, quote, hold on to Dalton, and to, quote, look out for Dug Gap.
That afternoon, Hood was back in Dalton. One of the divisions slated to join him at Resaca instead went to Dug Gap. The other 2 halted their movement at Tilton on the railroad about halfway between Dalton and Resaca.
The next day, May 11th, the Confederates at Dug Gap reported an, quote, immense wagon train, end quote, rolling southward in the valley west of Rocky Face Ridge. However, that afternoon, Hood, who had returned to Resaca, reported all was quiet and that there was, quote, no enemy within 4 miles.
In the face of these conflicting reports, fortunately for the rebels, on May 11th, the leading units of Polk's reinforcements from Alabama reached Resaca, as did the Bishop General himself. And Johnston instructed Polk to have all his men move from Rome to Resaca as quickly as possible.
Polk's arrival on the scene brought changes in the Army of Tennessee's command structure and its organization. At first, Polk's troops remained technically a separate force operating with Johnston's army, but eventually those men constituted a 3rd Infantry Corps in the Army of Tennessee.
Exactly. Now, with Polk's arrival, the Confederate Army in Georgia was organized into 3 infantry corps under Polk, Hardee, and Hood, and a cavalry corps under Wheeler. Although the cavalry division that Polk brought remained an independent formation, commanded by Brigadier General William H. Jackson. But since Polk outranked Hardee, he became Johnston's second in command. However, the Bishop General's presence didn't alter relations among the Army's generals or between Johnston's headquarters and Richmond.
As y'all might recall, in 1862 and 63, Polk had been the leader of the anti-Bragg faction in the Army. Spoiler alert, But Polk was killed here a month after he got to Georgia. But had he lived longer, his presence would have certainly complicated matters with regard to the Army in Richmond, and quite likely between the old pro-Bragg and anti-Bragg factions in the Army.
Well, in any case, like Hardee, Polk had butted heads with Joe Johnston over administrative, logistical, and military matters in 1863 and early 1864. So once he joined the Army in Georgia, Polk, like Hardee, often found himself virtually ignored by Johnston, who continued to consult almost exclusively and rely heavily upon Hood.
But to get back to our story, Johnston held Hardee and Hood at Dalton on May 12th. Johnston later wrote that he remained passively in his fortified lines because he still hoped to draw Sherman into an attack on his strong position, and because he knew the railroad would allow him to quickly shift troops south to Resaca if the need arose.
Johnston made no effort to strike either at Sherman's force in front of Dalton or at the long Federal column reported to be toiling southward in the valley west of Rocky Face Ridge. It was only when a cavalry reconnaissance revealed that just a single Yankee infantry corps and some Union horsemen remained in front of Dalton that Joe Johnston finally realized what had happened, and he belatedly ordered Hardee and Hood to move their troops south as quickly as possible to the real point of danger at Resaca.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Battles for Atlanta, Sherman Moves East by Ronald H. Bailey and the editors of Time Life Books.
Yes, this is another volume in the old Time Life series on the Civil War, and we've been recommending different titles throughout the course of the podcast since they are a good introduction to different battles and campaigns with excellent illustrations and maps. Probably like quite a few of you, we have the entire series sitting on our bookshelf, and to be honest, we still pull them out quite often to page through one or the other of them.
You can always find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info about joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon, just like Gordon M.,
Michael S.,
Bruce O.,
and Jonathan S. have all done recently.
Well, thanks, guys.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.